There's a thing nobody tells you about a small town. It doesn't kill you, it just stops handing you things. The mercantile runs out of the flour you asked for, though the sacks are stacked behind the counter. The preacher's wife starts looking at your shoulder instead of your eyes. The bank finds a clause. Nobody raises a fist. Nobody has to. I watched a family do that to their own boy. Good people. People who'd sat up 3 nights with me when my fever broke. They stood in the road with lanterns and asked him for one thing, one small thing, the smallest thing in the world. Choose anyone but her. Anyone? The whole earth was on the table. Every girl in 4 counties, every widow with a quarter section, every future that came without a price. All he had to do was say a name that wasn't hers. He was 26 years old. He had a broken hand hanging off his wrist like something that didn't belong to him anymore, and he'd been standing in that road for close to an hour. I'm the one who was holding his horse. I've had 11 years to decide whether I should have let go of that bridle sooner. I still wind a watch that doesn't run. Make of that what you will. The lanterns made a wall. That's what I remember first. Not the words, not the crying, just the light. 6 lanterns held at chest height across the road where it narrows past the cottonwoods, and behind them the shapes of people I'd known since some of them were knee-high. Amos Vance in the middle with his hat off, which he never did outdoors, not for weather, not for God. His wife Etta beside him with both hands pressed flat against her stomach like she was holding something in. Ferris, the older brother, off to the left where he could move if he had to. And in front of them, 30 feet out, my boy was standing in the dust with his right hand held against his chest. He'd broken it about 4 hours earlier on Cordell Pike's jaw. I heard it go. Sounded like a dry branch. Pike went down and stayed down, and everybody in the yard behind Hensley stood there with their drinks and watched a man ruin his own life in the time it takes to swing. I had Weiss gelding by the bridle. Big ugly blue roan named Sermon because he was long and slow and you fell asleep on him. The horse kept shifting. Horses know. They always know before we do. Just say a name, son, Amos said. That was the whole of it. That was all they were asking. Any name, Amos said. Any girl in this county, in this territory. I'll build you a house. I'll deed you the north section outright tonight on paper. I've got the paper in the house. Just say a name that ain't hers. Weiss didn't say anything. The lanterns hissed. Somebody's lantern needed trimming, and even then, even in the middle of it, some part of my brain went, that wick's too long, that's a waste of oil, because that's what a mind does when it can't look straight at a thing. I want to tell this right, so I have to go back. She came to us in July, and she came on her own 2 feet, and I want that understood before anything else, because the story people tell in Grantham has him finding her half dead in a wash and carrying her home like a stray calf. That's not what happened. That's just the story they liked better, because in that story she's something that happens to him, something you could argue him out of. What happened was this. We had a stud colt named Ashes who'd gone wrong in the head. 2 years old, blood in him worth more than my life, and he'd started throwing himself at fences. Not jumping, throwing. He'd opened his chest on the wire twice, and Amos had already said the word, the short word, the one you say once and then you go somewhere else while somebody does it. I'd been breaking horses 31 years. I couldn't do a thing for him. There was a woman down at the Ojo Frio place, a Mexican outfit 40 miles south, who was supposed to be able to fix that kind of thing. That's all we knew. That's all anybody said. There's a woman down there. We rode down to ask if she'd come. He was gone 5 days. He came back in the evening, and she came in behind him on a paint mare of her own, riding easy, with her own saddle, her own bedroll, her own everything. She reined up in our yard and looked around at the place the way you look at a horse you might buy. She was Chiricahua, anybody could see it. She was maybe 24, and she had a face that didn't tell you anything, and she wore a man's canvas coat over a blue skirt, and she had her hair back in a wrap of red cloth. She had a knife on her belt and a hoof pick on a thong at her wrist and about 11 pounds of dust on her. Amos came out on the porch. "Wesley," he said, just the name. A question and a warning in 3 syllables. "My name's Dos Kerrigan, and I've heard Amos Vance say a man's name like that before, and it usually meant a man was about to be off the place." "This is the horse doctor," we said. "I sent you for a woman at Ojo Frio." "This is her." Amos looked at her a long moment. She looked back. Didn't smile, didn't drop her eyes, didn't do a single one of the things everybody in that yard expected her to do. "What's your name?" Amos said. "They call me Rosa at Ojo Frio," she said. Her English was flat and careful, the way it is when you learned it somewhere you didn't want to be. "That's the name the mission gave me. You can use it if you want. It's not mine." "What's yours, then?" "Nadze." Amos chewed on that. Behind him in the doorway, Etta had her hand on the frame. "How much?" Amos said. $4 a week, and I keep my own horse and I sleep where I choose, not in the house." $4 a week is a top hand's wage. "Then don't pay it," she said, and started to turn the mare. She'd have gone, that's the thing. She'd have ridden right back out of that yard and out of this story, and Wes Vance would be alive somewhere today, fat and 40 and complaining about his knees, married to some perfectly good woman whose name I'd have trouble recalling. "Wait," Amos said. He hated himself for it. I watched it happen on his face. But he had a colt out there with a chest like a plowed field and $800 of bloodline in him, and a note at the bank in Grantham that came due in November. "Look at the horse first," he said. She spent 4 hours with Ashes, and she didn't touch him once. She sat on the top rail of the round pen with her boots hooked in, and she watched him. He'd charge the fence and she'd sit there. He'd stop and blow and shake. She'd sit there. The sun went down. I brought her a cup of coffee, and she took it without looking at me, and I stood there like a fool for a second before I understood I'd been dismissed. I'll admit what I thought. I thought, this is theater. I thought she was running a game, $4 a week to sit on a fence and stare, and I was going to enjoy watching Amos figure that out. At full dark she came down off the rail and found Wes and me at the barn. "He's not crazy," she said. "He's deaf on one side. Something in the ear, an abscess maybe, it's gone bad and it doesn't drain. He can't tell where sound comes from. Everything is behind him. So he runs from everything, and everything is everywhere, so he runs into the fence." I felt about 2 inches tall, 31 years. "Can you fix it?" we said. "I can drain it. It'll hurt him and he'll fight me and I'll need him roped and down, and after that he'll either come right in a month or he won't come right at all." She pulled her coat straight. "And he'll never hear on that side. So don't sell him to somebody who'll work him in a team. He'll kill a man." That's we started and stopped. "What?" "Nothing," he said. "That's the first honest thing anybody's said on this place all year." She looked at him then, actually looked first time. "I saw it. God help me, I saw it happen and I thought it was nothing. I thought, that's a young man who's impressed. Young men get impressed. It passes like weather. The colt came right in 5 weeks. Here's what I didn't understand yet and what I understand now, 11 years too late. It wasn't that she was beautiful. She was some. That wasn't it, or that wasn't the size of it. It was that Wes Vance had spent his entire life on a place where nobody said what they meant. That's not a slander on the Vances. Amos loved his sons. Etta would have laid down in the road for either of them. But it was a house where you found out you disappointed somebody by the way the salt got passed. Where Ferris had wanted to go to St. Louis and study law and instead ate his supper every night for 9 years across from the father he never once told. Where the word no was a thing you communicated with the back of your neck. And into that house walks a woman who says $4 a week, and I sleep where I choose, and that's the name the mission gave me. It's not mine, and don't sell him to a man who'll work him in a team. He'll kill somebody. He didn't fall in love with an Indian woman. He fell in love with somebody who'd just say the thing. I'd give a good deal to have understood that in August. I might have said something useful. Instead, I watched them work. Because they did work all that fall she stayed on. There were 3 more horses she was worth 10 times her wage on. And Amos, who was not a fool about money even when he was a fool about everything else, kept paying her. And Wheeze was in that round pen every hour he wasn't needed elsewhere. And then some hours he was needed elsewhere, which I covered for, which is one more thing I get to carry. They didn't do anything. I want that clear too, because Grantham had opinions. For a long, long while they just worked. She'd say a thing about a horse and he'd say a thing back, and she'd correct him and he'd take it, which was not a thing Wheeze Vance had ever been able to do from a living soul, and I'd be at the far end of the barn pretending to oil a bridle I'd already oiled. The first time I heard her laugh was the 2nd week of September. He'd said something stupid, I don't know what. She laughed one syllable, like a cough, like it surprised her more than it surprised him, and then she stopped and looked at the ground. I remember thinking, she'd looked like a woman who'd caught herself doing something she'd been punished for once. I remember thinking that, and then going back to my bridle. Trouble came from town, the way it always does. Town is where people have time. Cordell Pike ran the freight yard and he was on the bank board, and his father had been at a place called Camp Grant, or said he had. And there's a kind of man who builds his whole self out of one story about what somebody did to his people once, and then spends 50 years collecting the interest from anybody who looks like they might be related to it. Pike started slow. He was patient, I'll give him that. First it was the mercantile. Etta went in for the fall order in October, and Hoyt Emery came around from behind the counter and talked to her out on the boardwalk, low, and Etta came home and sat in the wagon in our yard for a while before she came in. Then it was the beef contract. The Vance place had run beef to the agency at San Carlos and to 2 mining camps for 11 years, and in the 3rd week of October, there was suddenly a question about the quality of the last delivery. A question nobody had thought to raise at the time of the delivery. A question raised in a letter, on paper, by a man who'd eaten Etta Vance's pie at the Harvest Social 6 weeks earlier. Then it was the note at the bank. It came due in November. It had come due in November for 9 straight years and been rolled over in November for 9 straight years. And this year there was a fellow from Silver City on the board. A new fellow, and the new fellow had questions. Not one word of it was about her. That's what I need you to understand about how it's done. Not one single word in any of it. There was never a letter that said get rid of the Apache woman. There was just a slow closing like a hand. Amos knew. Etta knew. Ferris knew, and Ferris was the one it was actually going to fall on. Because Ferris had a wife and a baby girl and no St. Louis and no law degree and nothing in this world but a share of a ranch that was quietly being strangled. And Wheeze, I think Wheeze knew and couldn't make himself believe it. He was 26. He still thought a thing had to be said before it was real. The first time anybody said it out loud was a Sunday. Etta made a roast. That's how I knew it was coming. She made a roast when she had something to say, and she'd been making a roast every Sunday for 3 weeks and not saying it, and I'd been eating a lot of roast. I was at the table. I want that on the record, because a hand doesn't sit at the family table for that kind of conversation, and the fact that they let me sit there tells you they'd stopped thinking about who was in the room. Cordell Pike came to see me, Amos said. Wheeze didn't look up. That's so. He said the board would consider the note if the terms of the place were. Amos stopped, started again. He used the word settled. Settled. That's the word he used. We set his fork down. He was very calm. That was always the worst sign with him. Then say what he meant, Pa, just once in your life. Nobody breathed. He meant her, Ferris said. He said it fast, the way you pull a splinter. And once it was said, it was in the room and it was never getting out again. She's a hired hand, we said. Wesley, she's a hired hand who saved you an $800 colt and 2 brood mares, and she gets $4 a week and sleeps in the tack room in October, and I'd like somebody at this table to tell me what she's done. She hasn't done anything, Etta said. Sweetheart baby. She hasn't done one single thing wrong, and that isn't what this is. Then what is it? And Etta Vance, who I'd known 20 years, who had put her hand on my forehead when I had the fever in '78 and sat there till dawn, looked at her son and said, "It's what it costs." He was gone from the table before the plate stopped rocking. I found him at the barn. He was standing in the dark not doing anything, which is a thing I've never in my life seen him do. "Das," he said, "am I crazy?" "No. Because it feels," he stopped. His jaw was working. "It feels like I'm the only one who can see the room. I wound my watch. It doesn't run. It hasn't run since 1869, and I wind it every morning and every night and once when I don't know what else to do with my hands. And Wheeze had asked me about it exactly once, when he was about 9, and I told him, and he never asked again." "You ain't crazy," I said. "You're just young enough to think that being right helps." He laughed, sort of. "Wheeze," I said, "have you asked her?" "Asked her what?" "Anything. Have you asked her one single thing about what she wants?" He didn't answer. And that, right there, that's the piece I'd tear out of the whole year if God gave me one. Because he hadn't. He'd been defending her for 3 weeks in rooms she wasn't in, and he'd been carrying her like a flag, and he'd never once walked out to the tack room and asked her what she thought about any of it. He thought he was fighting for her. He was fighting for the version of himself who'd fight for her. There's a difference, and it's the difference that ate him. I know what she said when he finally asked, because she told me later, when there wasn't much else left to say, and she needed somebody to say it to. She said he came out to the tack room in the middle of the night, and she was awake, because she was always awake, because she'd been awake in strange places since she was 11 years old. She said he said, "Tell me what you want and I'll do it." And she said she looked at him, and she thought, this is her words, near enough. This man is about to burn his family down and hand me the ashes and call it a gift. She said, "I want to work with horses and not be anybody's reason." He didn't understand. She said, "Wheeze, every person in that house is going to spend the rest of their life saying my name when they mean the thing that ruined them. I've been somebody's reason before. When I was 14, there was a soldier who liked me, and 11 people paid for it, and none of them were him." He said, "That's not what this is." And she said, and she told me this with her face perfectly still, sitting on a chopping block in a yard 11 years ago, she said, "It's never what it is. It's only ever what it costs." Same words as his mother. Different mouths, same sentence, and neither of them ever knew the other one said it. She told him to let her go south. Ojo Frio would take her back. There was a man there with a bad colt every spring. It was work. It was enough. And he said no. He said no, and I have thought about his no for 11 years, and I still can't tell you if it was the finest thing I ever saw a man do or the most selfish, and I've come to think there isn't a difference as clean as we'd like. Here's how it went to pieces. Saturday the 8th of November. Cattle sale in Grantham, which meant the whole county in one place, which meant whiskey, which meant Cordell Pike with an audience. We were in the yard behind Hensley's. 20, 30 men. We had brought the string in, and Nadzay had come because 2 of the horses were hers to hand over, and she wasn't going to let a stranger take them without telling him what they needed. That's it. That's the whole reason she was in town, because a horse might be handled wrong. Pike waited till she walked past. He said a thing. I'm not going to write it. I heard it, and I've spent 11 years not repeating it, and I'm not going to start now. It was 4 words. It was cheap, and it was about her, and it was designed, engineered like a fence, like a gate, to be heard by exactly one person. And here's the part nobody in Grantham tells. Nadzay didn't stop walking. She didn't flinch. She'd heard it 100 times in a dozen towns, and she had a mare's lead rope in her hand and a place to be, and she just kept going, and I saw her face, and her face said, "This is Tuesday." She was fine. She'd already survived it. She survived it while it was happening. It was Wheeze who couldn't. He hit Cordell Pike so hard, he broke 4 bones in his own hand, and Pike went into the water trough, and the whole yard went quiet, and Nadzay stopped in the road and turned around, and her face, for the first time since July, showed something. It wasn't gratitude. It was the look you'd give a man who just put a match to a hay barn to prove he loved you. Pike was up in 10 minutes, spitting and shouting and a tooth in his hand. He wasn't hurt. That's the joke of it, the whole thing, everything after, the entire ruin, and Cordell Pike was fine by Thursday. But he had it now. He'd been fishing since July, and Wheeze had swallowed the hook clean. He didn't sue, he didn't shoot. He was patient, like I said. He went to the agency man. Because there was a thing about a pass, you see. There was a piece of paper that said an Apache off the reservation had leave to be off it, and if you didn't have one, you were a fugitive, and it didn't matter that you'd been off since you were 19, and it didn't matter that you'd been working for wages and paying for your own feed and never taken a thing from anybody. There was a piece of paper, or there wasn't. Nadzay didn't have one. She'd never had one. Not in 5 years at Ojo Frio, not anywhere. And not one soul had ever asked, because nobody had ever wanted to ask, and that's the thing about those laws, they don't get enforced, they get deployed. They came for her at 4 in the afternoon on the 10th. 2 men from the agency and a deputy, polite as Sunday, hats in their hands. Wheeze was in the house with his hand splinted, and a fever coming up in it. I was in the yard. She was cleaning a hoof. She set the foot down. She wiped the pick on her skirt. She looked at me and she said, quiet so the men wouldn't hear, "Das, don't let him follow." And I said, because I am in the end, a man who winds a watch that doesn't run, I said, "I'll try." She went with them. She didn't look back at the house. She was up on the deputy's spare horse before Wheeze got to the door, and she was 100 yards down the road before he got to the gate, and I don't think she ever knew he was screaming, because the wind was out of the north that day, and it took his voice the other way. Which brings us back to the lanterns. Because that's the same night, that's what I've been circling. 6 lanterns across the road at 10 in the evening, and Wheeze Vance with a broken hand and Sermon saddled, and me holding the bridle because he couldn't rope a horse one-handed and had asked me. And I'd done it. God forgive me. I'd saddled his horse for him and then stood between him, and it like a coward with his own reins in my fist. They'd known. Amos had ridden to town and back, and he knew where she was going, Bowie, then a train, then wherever they sent her, and it was 300 miles, and it was over. Unless somebody rode after her tonight. "Just say a name, son," Amos said. Etta was crying without a sound. Ferris had his hand on his father's shoulder, and Ferris was the one I couldn't look at, because Ferris had a baby girl asleep in that house and a bank note in November, and he had never in his life gotten one single thing he wanted, and he was standing in a road at 10 at night asking his little brother for one. "Any name," Amos said. "Wesley, any name. I'll take it, that's all. That's the whole of it. Say a name that ain't hers, and this all goes away. Tomorrow by dinner I'll have Pike on this porch shaking your hand." "She has a name," we said. That's all he said. Amos put his hat back on, slow. That was how I knew it was finished. "Then you're not," he said, and his voice went out from under him like a horse stepping in a hole, and he had to stop and start over, an old man in a road with his hat on straight. "Then you're not my son." "All right," we said. He turned and he looked at me. "And I want to tell you, I let go of that bridle because I'm a good man. I want to tell you I did it for love. I let go because I was tired. That's all. That's the entire reason. 54 years old, 31 of them breaking horses, standing in the dust between a boy and his whole family, and my shoulder hurt, and I was tired, and I opened my hand. He was up in the saddle in one motion, one-handed, which I'd have told you couldn't be done, and Etta screamed his name once, and he was gone north into the dark, and the lanterns didn't follow him because lanterns never do. He caught up to them at the Bowie Road. I know because I found the place after. 2 days after, when it was all over and there was nothing left to find but the place. Amos Vance milked the cow. That's what I woke up to. 6:15 in the morning, the 10th of November, the 11th now, I suppose. The days had run together, and I came out of the bunkhouse with my boots half on, and there was Amos on the stool with his forehead against that cow's flank, hands going, SSSD, SSSD, SSSD into the pail, same as every morning of the last 20 years. His son had ridden out of his life at 10 o'clock the night before, and he was milking the cow. I stood there watching him, and I understood something about that family that all their talking had never taught me. They didn't know any other way to be. There wasn't a single thing in Amos Vance's whole education that told him what a man does the morning after. So he did the chores. He did the chores like a man reading the only book he owns. He didn't look up. "Kerrigan," he said, "them yearlings need moved off the flat before the weather." "Amos." "Before the weather," he said, "and the SSSD never broke rhythm, and I went and got my coffee. Etta was in the kitchen, and she made breakfast for 6. That's what I can't get out of my head, even now, 6 plates. Eggs, side meat, the biscuits, the whole works, and there were 4 of us on the place, and one of us was in the barn, and one of us was a hired man who ate at the bunkhouse most mornings." She saw me in the door and she said, "There's plenty," and her voice was absolutely level, and her hands were shaking so bad she couldn't get the coffee pot to the cup, so she set it down and put both hands flat on the table and stood there with her head down. "Yetta, don't," she said. "I only. Das Kerrigan, if you say one kind word to me, I will come apart in this kitchen, and I have got a granddaughter asleep upstairs, and I have got to be standing up when she comes down them stairs, so don't." I went out. I've turned that over a lot of nights. People think grief is the loud thing. It ain't. Grief is a woman doing arithmetic on how many hours she can stay vertical. Ferris was saddling. He had his good horse out, the sorrel, and a bedroll on and a rifle in the scabbard, and he was cinching up with his jaw set like a man doing a chore he'd been dreading for years. "Where?" I said. "North." "Your father know." "My father's milking the cow." He pulled the latigo. "Get your horse, Das." "Ferris." "He can't rope with that hand, and he can't tie a bedroll with that hand, and he rode out of here with no coat, and it was 29 degrees last night." He looked at me over the saddle. Ferris was 31 years old, and he had his mother's eyes and his father's whole entire way of not saying things. He'll die out there, and he won't even notice. So I got my horse. We rode north 4 hours before either of us spoke. The country up there is broken. Cut banks and creosote and long tan stretches where you can see 9 miles and there's nothing in any of it, and then a wash comes up out of nowhere and swallows 20 men. It was cold. There was ice in the shade of the rocks at noon. Tracking Sermon was easy. That roan was 17 hands and shod heavy, and he walked like a man carrying furniture. What was hard was that the tracks didn't hurry. That's what I kept noticing. He hadn't run. A boy rides out of his father's life at a dead gallop. That's the story. That's the picture. But the marks in that dirt said Wes Vance had pulled up about a half-mile past the cottonwoods and walked that horse north all night at about 4 miles an hour like a man going to a job he'd been at for years. I've never decided whether that's the saddest thing in this or the strongest. Around 1 o'clock Ferris said, "I was going to go to St. Louis." I let him have it, didn't say a thing. 1879. I had it all arranged. There was a firm, a man Uncle Coy knew. They'd have took me on as a clerk and paid the school, and I'd have been 3 years in and out the other side. He was looking straight ahead at nothing. I had the letter in my coat for 11 days. What happened? Nothing happened. He laughed one note ugly. That's the whole story, Das. Nothing happened. I kept the letter in my coat and I ate supper 11 times, and every time I opened my mouth Pod'd be talking about the fence on the south section. And then one day the letter was old and it was too late to send it, and that was that. Nobody stopped me. Nobody said a word. He made a small motion with his hand, opening it, letting something fall out. I set it down. He wrote a while. That's what I can't stand, he said. Not that he went, that he could. And I understood right then that Ferris Vance wasn't riding north to save his brother. He was riding north to see it with his own eyes, to watch a man do the thing. Just once before he died, he wanted to stand close enough to somebody who'd said no out loud that maybe a little would come off on him. Some men would call that jealousy. I'd call it a thirst. We hit the Bowie Road at 4 and found the deputies camped 2 miles east of the crossing. They'd laid up there the night, 3 men from the agency escort, the deputy, a wagon, a fire ring still warm enough to draw a hand to. And sitting on the tailgate of that wagon with his hat off and a cold pipe in his teeth was Holly's Ryland. I'd known Holly's 11 years. He'd been a decent enough hand before he took the badge, and taking the badge was the worst thing that ever happened to him, and everybody knew it, including him. He saw us coming, and he didn't get up. Das, he said. Holly's. You're gonna ask me. I am. He took the pipe out of his mouth and looked at it. There wasn't anything in it. He'd been sucking on an empty pipe for God knows how long. They're 8 hours ahead, he said. 2 of the agency men and the woman. I turned back at the crossing. My jurisdiction ends at the crossing, and I have never in my life been so grateful for a line on a map. Ferris said, "Where's my brother?" Holly's put the pipe back in his teeth. Ferris, he said, sit down. I don't want to sit down. I know you don't. Here's what Holly's Ryland told us, sitting on that tailgate with the sun going flat and orange across the whole world. We's caught them at the crossing at about 4 in the morning. He came up out of the dark on that big roan, and the agency men had their guns halfway out before they saw the state of him. And then they didn't bother, because he wasn't armed and he was swaying, and his right hand was strapped to his chest and puffed up to about twice the size of the left one. He didn't shout. Holly's was clear on that, and Holly's had no reason to make it pretty. He said, I've come to make an arrangement. He'd worked it all out on that 4-mile-an-hour ride. He had it in his mouth like a speech. He'd stand surety. He'd post a bond. He had $211, which was every cent he had in the world, and he'd sell the roan for another 90, and he'd sign a paper making himself responsible for her. And there was a thing you could do. He'd heard of it. In Silver City there was a woman who'd been. And Holly said the agency man, a fellow named Prather, just stood there and let him talk himself all the way out, all the way down, till there wasn't anything left, the way you let a colt run itself out against the fence. And then Prather said, son, there ain't a bond, there ain't a paper, it's not a debt, there's nothing to pay. And we said, and Holly said this part real quiet, we said, there's always something to pay. Not this time, Prather said. This time there's just a list and she's on it, and you can't buy her off a list. Holly said, we stood there in the dark for a long moment, and you could hear him breathing. And then he turned to her. She was on the spare horse. She hadn't said one word the whole time. She'd sat that horse and watched him come apart in front of 4 men, and her face, Holly said her face was the worst part. Not because it showed something, because it showed nothing at all. He said it was like watching a woman listen to weather. We said, Nadze. And she said, who are you? I made Holly say it twice. She said, who are you? He wouldn't look at me. Prather says, "You know this man." And she says, "And Das, I want you to understand," she said it bored. She said it like a woman being asked about a stranger's dog, she says. "He came out to the crossing to sell you a horse. I've seen him at the yard in Grantham. I don't know his name." Ferris said, "That's a lie." "Course it's a lie. She lived on our place 4 months, she." Ferris, Holly's finally looked up, think for 1 minute. And Ferris opened his mouth and then he shut it, and I watched it land on him, and it landed on me at the same time, and I've been carrying it ever since. Because if she knows him, he's an accessory. If she knows him, if there's 4 months and a ranch and a broken hand over her honor in a public yard in front of 30 witnesses, then Prather's got a report to write, and Wes Vance's name goes in that report, and Cordell Pike is on the bank board, and there is a note due in November, and there is a baby girl asleep in a house 60 miles south. 4 words, who are you? She burned herself down to the ground to keep the fire off that house, off Ferris, off Etta, off a family that had sat at a table and priced her like feed. And the thing that finishes me, the thing I have never been able to get past in 11 years, is that she did it in a way that didn't cost them anything either. She didn't make it a sacrifice they'd have to look at. She didn't make a speech. She made it boring. She handed them their whole lives back wrapped up so plain that they'd never even know they'd been given a gift. And then she rode off, and the Vances of Grantham have spent a decade telling each other that the Indian woman didn't care about him. That's the piece of it I'd fix if I could fix one piece. Not the road, not the bridle, that. What'd he do? Ferris said. Holly said we didn't say anything at all. He said we stood there for maybe 10 seconds, and then he took his hat off the way you do at a funeral, the way his father had in the road, and he said, "Beg pardon, ma'am," and he stepped back out of the way and let the wagon go. And Holly's Ryland, who I have known 11 years, who has seen men hanged, sat on that tailgate and said, "I've never heard anything worse than that in my life." We rode on, of course we did. Found the camp about 2 hours later, off the road, in a little pocket of ground behind a rise where you could see the crossing, but the crossing couldn't see you. He'd been there all night. Before the crossing, I mean, that's what took me a while to work out. He'd got there in the dark before they did, and he'd sat up on that rise and watched their fire, and he'd waited till 4 in the morning to go down. 6 hours. There was no fire. He hadn't lit one in 29 degrees with no coat and a hand going septic, because a fire would have been seen. Sermon had been tied to a mesquite. You could read the whole night in the ground under that tree. The horse's circle, the manure, the place where he'd pawed and given it up. And then there was the other circle. 30 feet across, more or less oval, worn into that hard dirt like something an animal makes. Back and forth, back and forth. I got down and walked it, and Ferris got down and walked it behind me, and neither of us said a word because you could count them. You could count the passes. The dirt was scuffed maybe 200 times, 300, and there were places where he'd stopped and stood. You could see both boots, close together, facing the crossing, and stood long enough for the toes to press in. He'd walked that circle for 6 hours in the cold with his hand rotting, working out what to say. That's what I found. 2 days I'd tell people later that I went looking for Wes Vance and all I found was a place, and they always thought I meant a grave. I meant the circle. Ferris sat down on a rock and put his hands over his face and made a sound I'm not going to describe. We got to Bowie the next afternoon. Bowie in '85 was a water tank, a store, a saloon that was mostly a tent and a rail siding, and the whole town smelled like creosote and hot iron and men who'd been on a train. There was a wind that never stopped, grit in your teeth all day. The train was gone. Of course it was. It had gone at 11 that morning east, and the fellow at the tank said yes, there'd been an agency wagon, and yes, there'd been a woman, and he said it the way you'd report on a shipment of nails. We found Sermon at the corral behind the store. That's how we found Wes, actually. I saw that ugly roan head over the rail from 100 yards off, and my stomach went out from under me, because a man doesn't leave a horse like that unless something's happened to the man. He was in the back of the store. They put him on a cot in the storeroom among the flour sacks, and there was a man with him, an old fellow named Beaudry who'd been an army surgeon at some point in his life, and was now a drunk who set bones in Bowie for whiskey money. And Beaudry looked up at us and said, "You kin." "Brother," Ferris said. "Then you got a decision to make." Wheeze was awake. That's what got me. His hand was a thing I'm not going to describe, and there were red lines running up past his elbow, and he had a fever you could feel standing 3 feet off, and he was awake, and he was arguing. "Ferris," he said, "like we'd met on the road, like it was Tuesday." Beaudry said it plain, the way those old army men do, because they've said it 400 times and there's no way to soften a thing you've said 400 times. Blood poisoning. It's in the hand and it's coming up the arm. It comes off above the elbow tonight or he's dead by Friday. He won't consent. He won't consent, Ferris repeated. Been arguing with me since noon. Ferris looked at his brother. And Wheeze Vance, 26 years old, lying in a storeroom in Bowie, Arizona, on a cot among the flour sacks, 300 miles from the woman who'd looked him in the face and said, "Who are you?" said, "I can't work a string one-handed." Wheeze. San Carlos takes on laborers. They take on white men, teamsters and such. There's a stock program. They run mules and they run horses and they need men who can. He stopped and breathed. It cost him. They need men who can gentle stock. That's a job. That's a job, Ferris. It's a real job. They pay it $30 a month and found, and I can be there. Ferris didn't say anything. I can be there, we said again. Do you understand? I'd be there every day. She'd know where I was. And Ferris said, very quietly, "You'd rather be a stranger there than a son here." Wheeze turned his head on the cot. "That's what you don't get," he said. "There ain't a here." I'm going to write down what Ferris did next, because in 11 years I've never told a living soul, and I'm getting old and somebody ought to know. Ferris told him about the note. He didn't have to. There was a dying man on a cot and he told him anyway, told him Pike had it, told him the board was calling it, told him the place went in the spring if it went at all, told him about his own daughter, told him all of it, standing over his brother in a storeroom with the wind rattling the tin, and I stood there and I let him. I let him. And when he was done he said, "So if you're doing this, if you're going to lay down there and die over a woman who told 4 men she never met you, then you do it knowing. You don't get to do it clean. Everybody in this family has paid and never once said what it cost, and I am done, Wheeze. I'm done being the one who never says it. It's costing me my house." Nobody breathed, same as the roast. Same table, different room, 600 miles of dirt in between. Wheeze lay there. And then he said the thing that I think about more than anything else in this whole business. More than the lanterns, more than the circle, more than her face when she laughed that one syllable in September. He said, "Ferris, why didn't you go to St. Louis?" Ferris's mouth came open. "You had the letter," we said. His eyes were bright with the fever and his voice was a rag, but he had him. He had him dead to rights and he'd had him for 6 years. "You had it in your coat. I saw it. I was 19 and I saw the corner of it sticking up and I never said a word because I figured any day now you'd go, and you didn't go, and you never told nobody why." "That's not." "Nobody stopped you," we said. "Did they?" "Nobody said one word, you just set it down." And Ferris Vance stood there in a storeroom in Bowie and had absolutely nothing to say. Beaudry got tired of it around 8 o'clock. He was a drunk, but he was a professional, and there's a point where a professional stops asking. He came in with a bottle and a roll of instruments and he said, "Son, there ain't any version of this where you keep the hand. There's a version where you keep the arm at the elbow if we go in the next 2 hours, and there's a version where it's the shoulder tomorrow, and there's a version where I write your mother a letter. Pick. We's looked at the ceiling a long time. Will they take a one-armed man, he said, at the agency? How the hell would I know? Because I'm not doing it to live, we said. Living's not the I'm not, he stopped. His jaw was going. If it don't get me there, I don't want it. And Beaudry, God bless him, that filthy old drunk, leaned down and put his face right next to that boy's and said, then you'll go there missing an arm, and you'll be a man missing an arm who's there. Or you'll be a man with 2 good hands in a box in Grantham. Those are your 2. And Wes Vance started to cry. I'd known him since he was 6 years old, and I had never once seen it, not when his horse died, not when his grandfather went, not in the road with the lanterns. He cried like a boy, loud and ugly and no dignity in it at all, and Ferris got down on his knees on that dirt floor and put his forehead against his brother's forehead and held the back of his neck with one hand the way you do with a foal that won't get up. And I went outside. I want that understood. I went outside. That's what I did with my hands that night. 54 years old, 31 of them breaking horses, and I stood in the dark behind a store in Bowie with the wind coming off the desert, and I took out a watch that has not run since 1869, and I wound it. It took Beaudry 40 minutes. I know because I counted. That's what I have instead of a working watch, I count. I counted at the crossing, and I counted in the road with the lanterns, and I counted that night, 40 minutes and about 11 seconds, standing in the wind, listening to the tin rattle, and twice, to a sound come out of that building that I have never repeated to Etta Vance and never will. Then it went quiet, and Ferris came out. He came out with his sleeves rolled and his forearms wet to the elbow, and he walked past me maybe 6 feet and stopped and stood there facing the dark with his back to the light. And I said, Ferris. And he said, it's on the floor. That's it. That's what Ferris Vance had, standing in the wind behind a store in Bowie with his brother's blood to the elbow, 6 feet from me, facing the dark. It's on the floor, Das. It's laying there. Beaudry stepped over it. He stepped over it to get his bottle. I didn't say anything. That hand pulled me out of the sauna when I was 15, he said. Broke ice on the trough every morning of its life. Hit one man one time, and it's laying on a floor in Bowie. He bent over then and was sick in the dirt, and I stood there and let him, because there wasn't a thing on this earth I could have done that wasn't an insult. Then he straightened up and wiped his mouth with his wrist and said, he's asking for you. The storeroom smelled like carbolic and whiskey, and something under both of them that I won't put a word to. Beaudry was gone to the tent saloon to get paid in the only currency he took. Somebody'd covered the floor with a feed sack. Wes was gray. He was gray, and he was awake again, which by then I'd stopped being surprised by. Das. I'm here. Sermon. He's at the corral. He's fine. Sell him. Wes. Sell him and give Ferris the money and tell him it's toward the note. His eyes weren't tracking right. He was talking to a spot about a foot left of me. It's $90. It ain't nothing. $90 is $90. It's 1,100 short is what it is. Then it's 1,100 short and $90 less short, he said. And even mostly dead, he said it with that flat Vance stubbornness that had ruined every one of them. And I thought, God, you are your father's son, and you'll go in the ground never knowing it. I said I'd do it. He shut his eyes. Then he said, Das, what's the watch? I hadn't touched it. I hadn't taken it out. He couldn't have seen it. He was flat on his back on a cot with a fever of 104, and I had my hands at my sides. But he knew. He'd known since he was 9. You told me once, he said. I don't remember. I was little. You don't need it tonight, son. I might not get another night. So I told him. I told him it was my brother's. I told him Cade Kerrigan was 19 and I was 17, and we were driving cattle up out of Texas in '69, and there was a river and Cade went in after a heifer worth about $4, and I stood on the bank and I could swim, and I didn't go in. I told him it took 11 seconds. I'd counted. I've been counting ever since. I told him they found him 2 days downstream, and the watch in his vest had stopped at 4:18 because that's when it went in the water, and I've wound it every day for 16 years, and it has never once run, and I know it will never run, and I wind it anyway. Weeze was quiet a while. Then he said, "You held my horse." "Yes." "You let go." "Yes." "You went in this time," he said. And then he was asleep or unconscious, and I sat on a flour sack in a storeroom in Bowie, Arizona, and cried like an old fool for the first time since I was 17 years old. He lived. I want to put that down plain and early, because I've drawn this out and I've made you sit in the dark with me, and it isn't fair to make a man wait on it. Weeze Vance lived. He was 6 weeks in Bowie, and Ferris stayed the first 3 and I stayed the last 3. And by Christmas he could sit up and swear at people, and in February he could ride. Riding one-armed is a thing. I'd have told you it couldn't be done, and then I watched a boy do it out of pure spite in a corral behind a store, falling off maybe 40 times, using his teeth on the reins like an animal, and old Beaudry sitting on a barrel drinking and hollering advice like a man at a cockfight. He got so he could rope, after a fashion, dally off the horn with one hand and a mouthful of rope and no margin at all for a mistake. It's a fool's way to work. Every good hand in the territory would tell you it'd kill him inside a year. It didn't. The ranch went. I'm sorry. There's no version of this where I get to hand you that. Pike had the board and the board had the paper and the paper had a date on it and the date came in March. There wasn't a villain in the room. That's what nobody believes. There was a table with 6 men at it, and every single one of them was sorry, and 4 of them had eaten Etta's pie, and they voted the way they voted because there was a new fellow from Silver City who asked what the collateral was worth, and nobody in that room could look at Amos Vance and say it's worth more than it's worth. They sold in April. 940 acres, the house, the barn Amos's father built, the whole of it, and it made $1,100 more than the note. $1,100, that's what 40 years came to after. Amos took a place outside Wilcox, 60 acres and a house with 3 rooms, and he ran about 40 head, and he kept it clean as a church. Etta had a garden, and it was a good garden. They lived 11 more years, both of them, and I've been out there I don't know how many times. Amos Vance never said his son's name again. Not once. Not in 11 years. Not sick, not drunk, and he did get drunk twice that I know of. Not dying, and I was there when he died, and I'd have bet a year's wages that it'd come out at the end, that a man on his last night would say the boy's name. He talked about a fence. He was worried about a fence on a place he hadn't owned in a decade. He said, "Kerrigan, that south wire's down," and then he went. Etta said the name every day of her life. Every single day, to me, to the granddaughter, to the stove. She wrote him letters that Ferris carried, and I don't know what was in them, and neither does anybody now. That's what a family is, I've come to think. It's 2 people looking at the same hole in the ground, and one of them can't stop pointing at it, and the other one can't ever look. Ferris didn't lose his daughter, and he didn't lose his wife, and he didn't go to St. Louis. He went to Tucson, and he clerked in a freight office, and he was 32 years old, and it was too late, and he did it anyway badly, and his hands never stopped being a cowboy's hands. He was miserable for about 4 years. Then he was all right. Then somewhere in there, he was actually happy in a small way, in a way he'd never have picked out of a catalog, a house with a fence he didn't have to mend, a girl who grew up reading, a wife who got to see him at noon. He said to me once, years on, "I keep waiting to feel like it was worth it." I said, does it feel like it was worth it? And he thought about it a long while and said, it feels like it happened. I've never heard anything truer about a life. Now wheeze. He got to San Carlos in June of '86, which is a thing I still can't make sense of when I say it out loud, because June of '86 was Geronimo's last summer, and that whole country was soldiers and dust and telegraph wire, and into it walks a one-armed white boy from Grantham asking after a job with the mule stock. They took him. That's the thing. They took him because he could gentle a horse better with one arm than any two-armed man they had, and because there was a war on and the war ate men, and nobody at an agency in June of 1886 was in a position to be particular. $30 a month and found. He didn't find her. 6 years by 6 years. She wasn't at San Carlos. She'd never been at San Carlos. Whatever list she went on took her to Florida with the others on the trains, Fort Marion first, and then Alabama, Mount Vernon Barracks, where the wet got into people who'd been born in a dry country and killed about a quarter of them without ever firing a shot. He knew that by August of '86, knew it in 8 weeks. Knew he was 3,000 miles from the only reason he'd let a man cut his arm off with a saw in a storeroom. He stayed 9 years. I asked him. Of course I asked him. I rode out there in '89 with a letter from his mother in my coat, and I sat with him at a fire and I said, "Wheeze, why are you still here?" He'd got older in a way that had nothing to do with years. 29, and he had white in him already. He said, "Where'd I go?" "Anywhere." "Anywhere's the same as here." He poked the fire. He'd got very good at doing things one-handed. There was a whole grammar to it, little tricks, and you'd stop noticing after a day. This is the closest thing to a place where somebody knows her name. There's an old woman in the camp knew her mother. She told me what Nadzay means. Took me 2 years to get her to tell me. "What's it mean?" He looked at me across the fire. "That's mine," he said. And I never got it out of him. And he's been in the ground 4 years now. And there is a word in this world that one white man in Arizona knew, and he took it with him. She came back in '94. They let them come back, some of them. The ones still breathing, not to Arizona, to Oklahoma, to a place called Fort Sill. And by then it had been 9 years, and Wheeze Vance was 34 years old and had one arm and $30 a month, and about $600 saved, because he had not spent a dime on anything but a horse in a decade. He went. He quit the agency in October and rode east, and I got a letter from him in December, from Lawton, and it was 4 lines long because he wrote with his left hand like a child. It said he'd found her. It said she was alive. It said she was married. It said, "Das, she has a boy who is 6 years old and his ears stick out, and he has got no more sense around a horse than his mother, which is to say all the sense in the world. I am all right. Don't tell Ma the last part yet." I've turned that letter over more times than I've wound the watch. Because you want to know what happened next. I know you do. I did too. I read that letter standing in a post office in Wilcox, and I said out loud to nobody, "Well, what did she say?" Here's what I know, and it's all I know, and I got it out of him in pieces over 3 years, and he never once told it straight through. He found her at a horse pen. Of course he did. There was never going to be anywhere else. She looked up and she saw a one-armed white man standing at the rail, and she was 33 years old, and she'd buried a sister and a mother in Alabama in ground that was wet all year, and she looked at his sleeve. He said she looked at the sleeve first, before the face, and he watched her do the arithmetic, and he watched her get the answer, and she put the foot down and wiped the pick on her skirt. And she said, "You didn't." And he said, "I did." And Nadzay, who had not flinched at 4 words in a yard in Grantham, who had sat a horse, and said, "Who are you with a face like weather?" Nadzay put both hands on the top rail and put her head down on them, and stood there like that for a long time. He said her husband was a good man. He said it every time. He'd say it before you could ask, like a man getting out ahead of something. A Chiricahua fellow named So worked the same stock. Funny, apparently actually funny, made her laugh out loud in front of people. 9 years is 9 years. She was 24 when they took her, and she was in a swamp for 6 of them, and a man was kind to her in it. And Wes Vance never said one crooked word about him in his life, and I believe that cost him more than the arm did. He stayed in Lawton. He got a job. He was there 11 years. He saw her most weeks. They worked stock. He taught that boy with the ears to ride, which is a thing I'd give a good deal to have watched. A one-armed man and a 6-year-old and a pony in Oklahoma in the dust, both of them laughing. That's it, that's the whole of it, that's what he got. Now I'll say the thing I've been walking around this whole time. People hear this story, and they want it to be about a man who wouldn't walk away. That's the story Grantham tells now, in the version where he carried her out of a wash, the cowboy who defied them all. There's a fellow writes for a paper in Tucson, has told it twice, and both times it had a wedding in it. It wasn't about that. Here's what I finally understood, and it took me until his funeral to get it. Wes Vance's family asked him for one thing: choose anyone but her. And he refused, and he lost everything for it, and everybody thinks that means he chose her. He didn't choose her. She never asked to be chosen. She asked him flat out in a tack room in the dark to let her go south to Ojo Frio where there was work and a man with a bad colt every spring. She asked him to not do this, and he said no to that too. He didn't refuse to walk away from her. He refused to walk away from himself, from the one true thing he'd ever found, that a person could just say the thing. Say it out loud in a house where nobody ever had, where a letter sat in a coat pocket for 11 days and then got old. She wasn't the prize, she was the proof. And she knew it. God, she knew it in November of '85, standing in a road with a mare's lead rope, watching him break his hand for her honor when her honor had survived the whole thing unassisted. That look on her face, I've had 11 years on that look. It wasn't gratitude and it wasn't love. It was a woman watching a man mistake her for a mirror. And then she saved his family anyway. 4 words. Cost her everything, cost her the swamp and the sister and the 6 wet years. Nobody's ever put that on a wall. He died in 1905. He was 45. It wasn't the arm. It wasn't a horse. He had a thing in his chest that took about 7 months, and Etta was already gone by then, and Amos was 9 years in the ground, and Ferris went out to Lawton and sat with him at the end, and Ferris told me the last thing. He said Wes was mostly out of it, going in and out, and at some point in the night he got real clear the way they do, and he said, "Ferris, did you ever send it?" And Ferris said, "Send what?" And we said, "The letter," and went back under. Ferris Vance was 51 years old, sitting in a room in Oklahoma, and he had to go outside. She was at the burial. I was there. I made the trip, 61 years old with a bad hip, 3 days on a train, and I stood at the back because I'd earned the back. She came with her husband and her son, who was 17 by then and taller than any of us. She stood the way she'd always stood. She had gray in her hair and that same flat, careful English when the preacher asked if anybody had a word, and she didn't have a word. She shook her head one time. Afterward she came and found me. "Das Kerrigan," she said. "Ma'am." She looked at me for a while, then she said, "You held his horse." "I did." "You let go." I couldn't say anything. And Nadzay said, and I want this written the way she said it, because people are going to want it to be forgiveness, and I don't know that it was. She said, "Everybody in this looked at that boy and saw what he was for. His father saw a son. His brother saw a door. That town saw a lesson. I saw a mirror." She pulled her coat straight, same gesture, 30 years on. One person in his whole life just did what he asked and didn't want anything for it. Ma'am, I've spent 11. I've spent 20 years thinking I killed him. You did, she said. And then she put her hand on my arm, just for a second. He'd have been fine, she said. He'd have married somebody and got fat and hated his life and never known why and died at 80, and everybody'd have said, what a good man. You opened your hand and he got 20 years of the truth and it ate him alive. She was looking out at the country, not at me. I don't know which one I'd pick. I've never known. I've had 30 years and I still don't know. She walked away. That's the last time I ever saw her. I'm 74 now. I live in a room in Wilcox above a feed store, and there's a girl who brings me my supper and thinks I'm a nice old man. I've got a photograph. Ferris's granddaughter took it some years back at the place near Wilcox, Etta on the step with her hands in her apron, and Amos standing about a foot too far away from her the way he always did, and the lights wrong and nobody's smiling. There's no picture of we's anywhere on this earth. Nobody ever thought to take one. That's what happens to you if you're 26 and you're not important and you say the wrong name in a road at night. But I remember the roan. I remember that ugly blue horse turning north and the sound he made on that hardpan, and the lanterns not moving, and Etta's voice going out of her. And I remember the circle. 30 feet across, worn into the dirt behind a rise near the Bowie crossing. 300 passes in the cold. A boy walking and walking with his hand rotting off, working out what to say to a woman who was going to look at him and say, "Who are you?" and save his whole family with it. I've never been back. I could find it. It's still there, I expect. That country doesn't forget a thing. 418. That's what it says. It said 418 since I was 17 years old, and I wound it this morning like I wind it every morning. And I'll wind it tonight. And one of these days somebody's going to open a drawer in a room above a feed store and find a watch that don't run, and they won't know why anybody